Mr. Michaca.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Glad to be back in Johannesburg. I think last time I was here was about 6-7 months ago. Madiba was still alive, and like a lot of you, I was kind of sad to see this great man passing away. And I was watching, that famous ceremony that took place in the stadium where all the world leaders gathered, and some of the epic moments of that day, if you remember, like when Obama was taking a selfie and making his wife mad at the same time. And there was also another epic moment where that interpreter was trying to, do a sequel of Lost in Translation and lost us on the way. But as I was watching the ceremony, I was, thinking, reflecting, and something dawned on me. And I said, what was the biggest difference between Madiba and all the other leaders that were here? Any idea? He was the only one who went to prison before becoming president. As to all the others, I think the jury is still out. So on that positive note, let me tell you what I'm going to take you through in the next 45 minutes. I'm going to start to talk about a couple of big trends that we see in the industry, how those trends are impacting the corporate strategy, the ripple effect that it has on IT. Then we're going to start to look also on innovation and the importance of innovation, what makes innovation happen in an organization and what stops it from happening. And at the very end, I'll give you a couple of ideas of what radical innovation means at Oracle. So let's start. I'll take you through 4 major pillars of what shapes a corporate strategy. The first one, a brief talk on the economy. I'm not going to go too much because I know Nenad is here and is going to give you a detailed brief on that. But just, spend a few important points on this. Then we're going to look at the business dynamics. We're going to look at the notion of time and transparency. And then we're going to look at our consumers that have, like Peter said, what do you call them? The MOFOs or the FOMOs? Okay, the FOMOs. So and we're going to look at them because this is also changing the way that we interact with them. So let's look at the economy. And if you look at this map of the world, this basically shows you the level of debt in percentage of the GDP of a country. And funny to observe here, apart from Sudan, which kind of is a bit of a mistake here, the economies that were driving the world in the last 2-3 decades are today in deep, deep debt. If you talk about the US, the whole of most of Europe today, and Japan. That's kind of an interesting observation. But then what you also see is that the world started to become divided along this diagonal, where you have in the south and the east high growth economies, and you have low growth economies at the top. And I kind of looked at a bit at South Africa, because it was supposed to be one of those countries that was part of the BRICS. There was a lot of hopes on the South African economy. 2 years ago when I was here, I was giving a speech, also at a conference, right around the time when this article came up in The Economist. And it was already warning about, things that South Africa needs to do from an economical point of view to reshape itself. And we saw what happened last week. We finally have seen that Nigeria has become now the largest economy. Now, I don't know if that is factual, whether they've been cooking the books, whether they've been sending emails, dodgy emails to the rest of the world in order to improve that ratio. But anyway, that's a fact. Another observation, if you start to now go towards the East Asia, you start to see also another interesting effect, which is when you looked at Fortune 500 corporation and the ranking in the last 2 decades, most of them were US, Europe, and Japanese companies. But now you start to see large corporation coming out of Asia-Pac. And let me give you a couple of examples. Haier has become the #1 in appliance. They took over General Electric. Let's look at Huawei. Now, Huawei had a pretty interesting run in Africa in the last decade. And if you think about what happened with Alcatel, Alcatel was kind of the dominant player because of their colonial ties. And when Huawei started to come into Africa in early 2000, they said, you know what, their products are crap. They can only discount them. We have the better products. 5 years later, 2005, the products became better, and Alcatel said, well, you know what, products are okay, but we have a large services organization. We are unbeatable. And then 2010, they had everything. Infrastructure, outsourcing, financing, everything. And they stood up and said, we don't know how to compete against those guys anymore. So you see, within a decade, you can lose it. And Samsung, also another fantastic story out of Korea and the run, the competition that they are putting on Apple and other manufacturers. So, and this is not something, the story about the debt, the sovereign debt, is not unique, because now we start to also see that, especially in Europe, that some corporations are also on the edge. If you look at this report, again, out of the Economist, 40% of the corporate debt are owned by companies that are not generating enough pre-tax earning to pay back just the interest on the debt. Now, luckily, in Europe at the moment, we are in a situation where the interests are still low. But, with all the quantitative easing that is taking place, at some point in time, the interests are going to start to rise, and a lot of those companies are going to go bust unless they fundamentally restructure themselves and reinvent themselves. So you're kind of now in an interesting world where high growth on one side, low growth on one side, and that, for marketeers, is changing the rule of the game. Because when you are in a high growth country, a lot of your consumers are in this category that we call I need it. So the first time entry, first time user of your products, and typical, this is one of those cases, I need the product, this is not a replacement, I want something basic that actually works. Compared to when you are in the low growth markets, the mature markets, where it's more the concept of I want it. And if you think about most of us, we have already an iPhone and a computer and a laptop and everything, and suddenly comes this beast, and everybody wants it. Is there a real need for an iPad? I'm not quite sure. So, but this is typically an I want product compared to I need a product. So let's also again think about it from a marketing point of view. Now, the IMD is a business school in Switzerland, and this professor, Garelli, is coming up every year with the competitive yearbook, and he's analyzing what actually makes a nation competitive, and he came up with those 5 points. One is the balanced finance, because, of course, if you have a high level of debt, there's no way you can reinvest that into innovation. So the importance of making sure that you keep this in balance. The second one is made in concept. And with this comes the importance of the intellectual property. The number of patents that your country actually generates, because that's going to help the made in concept. And with made in concept comes another one, which is then exporting, because you see small countries like Switzerland or Sweden, high level of patents, very innovative countries, but they are extremely export-led. So that helps you, of course, your balance of payment. A diversified economy, if you think about Saudi or Russia, they are a one-trick pony. It's all about oil and gas and oil and gas and oil and gas. And at the end, the SME space, develop the small and mid-sized enterprise, because these are the ones who are actually generating or creating new jobs. We see that, for instance, these are the companies that have a lot of apprentices, where you can actually transfer the knowledge and make sure that you have skilled labor in your country. So these are kind of the 5 major points. Now let's go and look at the business side of it. Now, what we have seen is that technology has this fantastic ability to lower barriers of entry. And if you think what happened in the telecom space, some of those operators have seen their cash cow disappear in a very short period. The cash cow of an operator was SMS traffic, and suddenly you have those little technology that are very disruptive coming out of nowhere and suddenly taking that huge revenue, that huge cash cow away from you. So, and this is not an isolated case. Think about what Amazon and Google are doing today. Think about what Facebook is doing to the banking industry, etc., etc. So who's next? And we also now live in a world that is totally interconnected. If you think about back to the subprime crisis, we thought that this was a financial crisis that was only focusing on the US. Not so. We very quickly find out that most of the banks around the world were part of that scam, okay? Which led into an economical crisis in Europe because a lot of the government had to go deep into debt to bail out the banks. It turned into a monetary crisis in Europe. The euro kind of lost its, how should I say, its importance. It turned into a social crisis. A lot of people lost their jobs. It turned into political crisis. A lot of leaders, were thrown out of office, etc., etc. I mean, I don't know, but I have never seen an event like this having such a profound impact around the world. And this is the world in which we live in, an interconnected world. And this is what I call the butterfly effect. So where somewhere a butterfly, flip his wings, and on the other side you have a tsunami. Now let's look at the other dimension, time and transparency. Because 10 years ago, most of those technologies were not here. They were invented 10 years ago, and we have seen the profound impact that they had on the way we work, the way we live, the way we collaborate, etc., etc. And this, of course, once you have a technology like this in your hand, like a mobile phone connected to the internet and a camera, that puts a huge pressure on transparency everywhere. Let me give you another example. You knew that we had elections in Turkey a week ago, and prior to the election, some of the scandals started to surface because of Twitter. So the Prime Minister, what did he decide to do? Is to turn off Twitter and turn the whole population into angry birds. You cannot do this. You cannot do this. I mean, sooner or later, you're going to have to pay for this. All right? And then, of course, there is this FOMO, constantly connected, people that are, hooked on their phone. And sometimes it can go to pretty extreme. And let me tell you a story that happens to me. I was in maybe that's going to be a red flag, but no, never mind. I'll go on a limb here. I was in a public toilet, and the walls were very thin, somebody next to me. And the guy says, "Hi." And I said, "Hi." And he says, "How are you?" I said, I'm doing fine, thank you. And, what are you up to? I guess the same thing as you. And suddenly he goes like, "Sorry, honey, but there's a fruitcake next to me answering my questions." So, how about having a break? So that's kind of this constantly connected world we live in. And then at the end, there is this Y generation, the young generation that grew up digitally, on social media, and this is really, again, putting more pressure on our corporation, because if you look how they are educated compared to us, where we learn through books, look at their table. They have a computer and an iPhone and an iPad and a television and I don't know what. You'd be lucky to find a book on their table. And this, of course, has a ripple effect on, how do we market to those customers? Because traditionally, we've been told, if you listen to Kotler, it was all about product, praise, promotion, etc. But now, there's a fifth P that has to be added to that equation, and that's people. Because for the first time in history, your consumer or your customers are not waiting at the end of a chain to be serviced. They can interact with you at any point in time. They can tell you what products they like. They can tell you what shape they want. They can tell you how you should maybe be innovating. They could become your best advocate, or they can become your worst nightmare. The choice is yours, but you need to manage this. So people. And with that, you have also this notion of explosion of data, because it's not only about social media, etc. You start to see more and more connected things, the Internet of Things, the third platform, all these terms that we now use to basically explain that it's not just people connected to the Internet, but it's more and more devices and biometric sensors, etc., etc. And this, of course, is creating this exponential growth on data. But, and the big but, and I'm not talking about this one because it definitely needs some trimming, the big but is you cannot throw more people at the equation. So the only way to manage it is to be able to do this through automation. So this is going to be the time for you to rethink your storage strategy and what it actually means, because there's no way you're going to be able to throw a huge amount of people to manage the explosion of data. And so, and this is where now it becomes interesting for CIOs, the difference between what we call the second platform and the third platform. So the second platform is what you guys are running in your data center, computers and servers and everything. But the third platform is this combination of cloud, mobile, social, and big data. And we start to see that because innovation is not happening fast enough in corporations, they tend to outsource this to nimble providers that can provide this as a service to them. And this is where we see most of the IT growth in the next couple of years is going to come in this segment, not in the segment below. So here, we're going to talk about things like consolidation and database as a service, these kind of initiatives. But a lot of the new application will be born in the cloud because you can basically do that much faster. Let me give you an example of Domino's Pizza. So there's no big deal about ordering pizza on a phone or through a web. But they pushed the user experience even further, and they created a little app on iPhone and Android where you can, at any point in time, follow where your pizza is. So you order it, fine, okay, it goes into the oven, okay, comes out of the oven, okay, it's on with the courier, and you can follow him, and it finally arrives at your place. It's no big deal. I mean, it's a simple application. But that created an explosion of their revenue. That simple, stupid little application. And that application was not designed by the IT department. It was basically outsourced to a small company. And that, of course, is changing the behavior, the procurement behavior, because the difference between the second and the third platform is kind of the difference between when you decide to go from A to B, and you're renting a car, and you're choosing between Avis and Hertz, compared to when you buy a car, and you're comparing between BMW and Audi. It's a very, the purpose is the same, but the buying behavior is completely different, and the people at which you market is also different. Because this is all about how to talk to CXOs, line of business managers, innovation managers, and at the bottom is more about talking about CIOs, DBAs, et cetera, et cetera. So, the impact, all this, what kind of impact it has on you and on your businesses. Because the challenge that you start to have now is a multitude of new things. So you're facing lack of budgets, like a lot of customers. You have your legacy that you need to deal with and complexity of processes, et cetera, et cetera. You need to manage the risk. There's no way you can introduce a new technology without having, a proper risk assessment and a proper SLA. And on the other side, you have the business that is telling you, we need to support more initiatives. You need to refresh your environment because we shouldn't be paying so much on maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. You need to take care of IT governance because now more and more, there's increased demand for governance, and we need, because of the Y generation, to improve how do we interact with our customers. And that is creating a gap between the IT capability and the requirements that the corporation have. And that gap is what we call the strategy execution gap, or the CIO depression curve, if you want so. So basically, what you're left with is, what service do I deploy, how fast, at what cost, what level of risk am I prepared to take, and should I actually buy it, or should I basically outsource it to the third platform? So, innovation, and the importance of innovation now. I think it's pretty clear that there's no way today we can ignore the subject, and if you want to stay ahead of the curve, that's the way to go. Now, let me take you through this little curve here, which is the traditional technology adoption curve. When a new technology comes into the market, it's fairly new, innovative, it's transformational, groundbreaking, untested, unproven. Over a certain period of time, what you see is it starts to become part of a bigger ecosystem. Then it becomes productized, and then right at the top of the curve, it becomes a commodity. Let's take an example that we all know. Let's take chip manufacturing. In the 80s, when Intel came in with the 8080 chip, again, that helped the whole industry to go into personal computing. That was something pretty innovative. After a while, we started to see a chipset and a whole motherboard. And then from there, it became blades. People bought an entire blade. And then now, you no longer think about it. You just go and procure some capacity on a cloud. Okay? Now, when you go along that curve, there are a couple of things that happen. First, the efficiency go up and demand go up. But at the same time, what you see is there is a commoditization effect that starts to take place. And the more you go up on that curve, the more that you see that the strategic importance starts to diminish. There is no need to start to continue to customize a general ledger anymore. I mean, that will bring no strategic value to the enterprise. That is way at the top of the curve. Okay, so sometimes you can even buy it as a service today. But this is very interesting for innovation, and let me explain you why. Because when products and technologies are at the top of that curve, when they are readily available and they are mature, you can start to think about assembling them, and assembling them will allow you to innovate fast enough and then create something that is, again, at the bottom of the curve. Let's take the example of social media. Social media could have not taken place if we didn't have internet available everywhere, if cheap blades technology was not available, and Web 2.0. And that process here is a process that is pretty well understood. It's called creative value destruction. And it's not something new. I mean, for those who did economical studies, this was something that was already preached 100 years ago by an Austrian professor called Schumpeter. It was about, how do you destroy your legacy fast enough in order to be able to move ahead? Okay? And for those who are interested, in The Economist, there is a Schumpeter section every week that talks about some of those cases. So this is my favorite section in The Economist, the Schumpeter section, because it talks about, how to fight conventional wisdom, how to re-engineer yourself, how to break out of your legacy, etc. Because basically what we're trying to achieve here is this, If you think about 100 years ago, when a company created a viable business and became successful, you had a guarantee to stay in that business for more than 65 years. Now, if you look at 100 years after, it's less than 9 years. Okay? So there's no guarantee that the success that you're having now is going to be forever. And in some industries, it's actually faster than 9 years. And look at how long it took us to reach 15 million users for different technologies. 30 years for radio, 17 for television, 3 years for internet, and a couple of weeks for the new iPhone. That's the speed of change. And this guy was head of Nokia Mobile, and when Steve Jobs in 2007 stood up and said, iPhone, this is the groundbreaking thing. And he stood up and said, who would need a computer and a phone in one device? And they were the market leader in those days. And guess now, we have more than 1 billion smartphone users in the world, and they have all one thing in common. They're not using a Nokia phone. Okay? So if you look at the mobile phone business, you have Apple that is innovating very fast, Samsung that is trying to copy them, and then you have Nokia at the back that's kind of lost. And this is how the market was kind of divided a while ago, and Samsung is playing catch up very, very fast now. Okay? So, this is another map, nothing to do with debt now. Now we're going to look at the importance of R&D. And what you see here is the percentage of R&D to GDP of a nation. And the darker it is, the more they spend on R&D. Now, if you've taken an absolute percentage, Israel is at the top of the league. 4.2% of their GDP is invested in R&D. But if you look at it in absolute value, the US is still the largest in absolute value. Now, 405 billion that is spent on high-tech R&D in the US every year. Now, let's hone on that little number, and let's put that into perspective with the R&D spend of Oracle, which we spend 5 billion a year. So that's more than 1.2% of the R&D spent in the US on innovation. That gives you an indication of the rate of innovation that Oracle is actually doing. And I'm going to take you through that journey later on. Because we need to break out of this cycle. You know, today you're spending most of your time and most of your budget to keep the lights on. And I need to be careful on how I use this terminology because I mentioned that in front of an exec of a utility company and said, you know, I don't get you. I'm in the business of keeping the lights on. So, you know, status quo is probably the more adequate word to use here. And we need to change this. The problem is that if you look at in the last decade, despite the fact that we're throwing 400 billion of R&D on high tech, we have not managed to change that equation. Why? Very simple. Because we do R&D in isolation. Somebody does chips, the other one does storage, the other one databases, the other one server, and nobody is looking at the whole ecosystem. And this is where the inefficiencies are. So we failed on that in that respect. And it's now well understood that innovation is the only trick that will take us out of our legacy and move forward. But we also know that the number one reason for failing in innovation is complexity. Complexity of your legacy, of your processes, etc., etc. Why did God invent or created the universe in 7 days? Because there was no legacy. You know, he started with a blank sheet of paper. It became messy after because of an apple and a snake and a woman, but at the beginning, it was pretty clean. You can tell I'm not very religious, huh? Yeah, although I was educated by Catholic priests, I must say, you know, maybe that's the reason. So, and we also see now that the role of the CIO is changing. It's no longer the guy who has to make sure that the lights is on, but he's becoming the chief process officer, the chief innovation officer, you know, making sure that that strategy execution gap reduces over time. And you have new challenges that are thrown at you. We discussed the importance of social media and the fact that this is now shifting the focus of a corporation from back office, cost and efficiency to front line, making sure that you interact with customers, you improve the loyalty, et cetera, to increase the revenue. So that's a big shift that is taking place. There's also this shift of this young generation that we talked about, the Y generation, that are prepared to share some of their private data against a better service. But there's another one that I want to draw your attention on, is this one. We did a little study, and we saw that the average age of a corporate application is more than 20 years old. Now, let's do a little math exercise. 20 years old, that takes us back to 1994. In those days, I'm talking about, say, in those days, like if it was the Middle Age, but for IT, it was the Middle Age. There was no mobile, there was no social, there was no Twitter, there was no BI. None of those technologies were available when those applications were conceived. And yet, you have this new breed of people coming into the workforce that grew up with those new technologies and going to have a big gap between what they have at home and what they see in their organizations. So that's going to be an additional challenge. So let me take you now through what we mean by radical innovation at Oracle. And the conventional wisdom says, successful company, what they do, they listen to their customers, they build a product, and they try to market it to them. Really? Really? Do you think that Steve Jobs woke up one morning and started to ask a lot of customers about what do they want? Would they want an iPhone or an iPad or an iPod? No. This guy was smart enough to understand what were the technologies that were getting close to the maturity curve that I talked about, how do you assemble them together, and how do you create something that will transform an industry. Larry Ellison, by the way, is exactly in the same camp. I'll show you why. And You may say, you know, is this only valuable for technology company? Actually not. This man did it 100 years ago. So if you listen to his customer, they wanted fast horses. And he gave them an iron horse. So this is not just a trick that is played in high tech. It can be applied to any industry if you have the right mindset. So let me take you now through the 2 decades of radical innovation that we have been driving into this company. And that's the result of it. I mean, this is not an accident. This is the credit of one man inside of the organization who has always been fighting conventional wisdom in the IT industry. And it really started in 1995, the heydays of Microsoft. And I remember because he gave a speech, a very powerful speech at the telecom event in Geneva, where he spoke just after Bill Gates. Bill Gates came up and said, you know what, Windows 95 is the biggest piece of engineering work ever done by mankind. Interesting. So Larry came after on stage and said, you know, apparently, according to Bill, that's it. That's the biggest thing ever done by mankind. Forget about putting people on the moon or, nuclear power plants or whatever. Windows 95, that's it. Then he goes silent for a while and he says, do you want this on your PC? I.e., do you want that complexity on your PC? And he said, you know what? This has gone too far. Client server is too complicated. We need to move to something, a network-centric model. There's this new technology called the internet. I'm not sure how far it's going to go, but I'm going to bet the company on it. If the internet becomes a success, we're going to be golden. If not, we're going to go bust. Guess what? Today, you all access your application through a browser. Okay? That was almost 20 years ago. Then came to 98, where the heydays of the dot-com, and everybody wanted to become a dot-com, and it was no longer just about automating a function, you had to automate a process. And in order to automate a process, you need to connect your back office to your front office application, etc., each of them having a different data model. And this is where the SIs were making a fortune on integrating all those pieces. And he said, you know what? This has gone too far. You need to engineer a set of applications that are engineered around a single data model. And this is where the e-business suite, came to market. Then in 2000, when we had the dot-com crash, this is where he said, you know what? Oracle was run at the time by countries. Every country manager was a king. He had his own IT, his own staff, etc. No process were the same across the globe. And he said, well, let's stop this nightmare. We have internet technology, we have the e-business suite. We're going to run Oracle on a global single instance with centralized processes standardized across the world. And we made $1 billion savings on this. Our revenue was going down, our margin was going up. Now, do you know a lot of companies that can do this? But we did it because we were very diligent in that approach. And Harvard Business School wrote a case on this. Then a couple of years down the road, 2005, we still were in a pretty fragmented market in terms of technologies, and you were responsible for stitching those things together. And we said, you know what? Let's simplify the whole equation for you. Let's take all those technologies, integrate them into a stack where it's based on standard, so you can decide if you want one part of the stack to run your systems. But if you want to benefit and innovate fast enough, we can give you an entire stack that has been engineered to work together. Okay? So that was the whole integrated stack story. And then at some point in time, there was a limit that we touched on in the R&D department, because there's a limit on how much you can do, in terms of performance improvement by doing software engineering only. And this was the time at which, the Sun acquisition came in, and we said, you know what? This is the time to rethink our engineering approach, and we started to put together hardware and software together. And, the history, it, Exadata, Exalogic, Supercluster, all those new technologies, again, groundbreaking technology that redefined the way a data center should be run and operated. And then you may say, okay, what's next? So we've done internet, we've done integration, we've done the total stack, we've done hardware and software. What's the next trick that this company can actually bring to the market? Larry never runs out of ideas, I tell you. So his next hack trick, and this is something that is now ready to be rolled out, is software into silicon. Because we believe that with the deluge of data that you're going to have to process in the next decade, conventional infrastructure is not going to cut it anymore. So what we're taking the concept of hardware and software and driving that further down into the chip. Because we saw that a lot of servers in the data center go in through their whole life and go out with only running Oracle workloads. So on that server, you have instruction set on that chip that is totally unused, that is not optimized for Oracle workloads. And this is where he started to say, you know what? We have a significant market share now on the software side. This is the time to start to create CPUs that are unique to Oracle, where some of the code is directly onto the chip. And we have already today a processor that is in the market, actually two processors in the market, the T5 and M6, where the early elements of that technology is already available. So security and encryption has already been put down on the silicon. And M7, which is a chip that is now in beta testing and will be launched at the end of the year, that's a 32-core processor. And with that, you have an accelerated database processor with the instruction set, the most frequently used instruction set of the database, on the chip. That is going to beat everything that you have in the market. And that's going to create, or is going to force you to rethink your architecture, because now what you see with those super fast CPU, you start to see that the bottleneck is at the storage level. The storage is not fast enough to respond to the capacity that you have available at CPU level. And we solved that problem partially with Exadata by integrating a compute node, a storage node, and a network node, and took care of a lot of those inefficiencies. But if you look at the install base, only 10% of our customers are running Exadata. You still have a huge install base out there that is still running traditional systems, and we need to find them a solution. And the solution is called FS1, Flash Storage Array. This is a product that we're launching in 2 months from now, in July. It's part of my product line. We're very excited about this product. It's a high-end storage array that was basically tightly integrated with our software stack. And just give you a brief idea of what you can do with this. We will give you, for instance, if you're running eBusiness Suite or PeopleSoft or JD Edwards, we'll give you the template on how to lay the data on that storage array. But because we also did it with this tight integration, we know that at some point in time of the day, of the week, of the month, of the quarter, some processes need more capacity. And we are capable of realigning the data dynamically to cater for that. So for instance, if you're doing a end of quarter closing, we know what are the data that support that process, and we move them dynamically into the storage array, into the fast part of the storage array. This is how, with automation, we help you to reduce the manpower to manage this data. You can do that, manually, but we can provide that with automation for you. So simplify, 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 in order to be able to innovate. That's kind of the trick, and this is what we've been very consistent for the last 2 decades. Only now, the jobs that we are doing are much bigger compared to what we did 20 years ago. And this is where now this whole engineered approach between hardware and software that is now going all the way down to silicon is becoming, the other option. Either you run on components and you assemble them yourself, but if you really want to be able to innovate fast enough, a lot of companies understand that this is the way to go. Because we have managed to prove that for the first time, more performance means less people, less software, and less hardware. And this is where, we can help you enormously in reducing your OpEx, reducing the CapEx, speeding up the cycle times, and that delta that you see here is something that you can reinvest in innovation. Now, I want to finish up with this. This is a case. I'm not allowed to mention the name of the company, but it's a large bank that went through a big re-engineering along the line of what I was talking about. They had their data center of the size of 3 football fields with 8,000 racks. Moved the whole thing through our engineered systems approach, 83 racks. The size of the data center went down to roughly one penalty area. Now, just do your math. Imagine what it means in terms of lease, electricity, cooling, etc., etc. When you talk to the CIO of this bank, he will tell you, performance was not what was driving my requirements. I was looking at something that will give me a sustainable competitive advantage over a long period of time. That is a sustainable competitive advantage. Because that, we took a mass of their OPEX, of their budget. So, 99% less racks, 94% less floor space. That was basically the business case at the end. So, I'm at the end, and I know we are in Africa, and you guys are the far end of the continent, and you have sometimes the impression that you're on your own, nothing really touches you. Not so. You're part of a global world that is more and more, as I said, interconnected. And this is the time for you to raise the stake and move into another league. But for that, you need new tricks. And I hope that through my presentation, I have managed just to open your eyes on a couple of ideas. Because you know what? Today, it's no longer just innovate to stay ahead of the game. It's actually innovate to survive. Thank you very much.